Recently, I watched a documentary on Netflix known as Greater Castles of Britain. And I wanted to watch this documentary in particular due to my recent research in my family history and noticing Stirling Castle and Edinburgh Castle coming up many times. Upon further research, I discovered I was actually a descendant of one of the main figures that these two episodes referred to in the documentary. It told of how mainly described King James and how he ruled from Edinburgh Castle. It included a lot of great historic information. I would love to travel there someday and see it for myself. However, I found it very funny that they kind of glossed over the part that upon my research, I found the most interesting. It discussed how King James, would keep mistresses in Stirling Castle and kind of made it out to be much more scandalous than you would think. These mistresses were not kept at the same time as his wife. He seemed to be a fairly loyal man, upon my research. It was noted that he treated his mistresses very well, and the union between him and Margaret Stuart, which would be the wife of Henry VIII, it was noted that while she was very young at the time, it is he it they didn't have the bedding ceremony, as you would call it. It was noted throughout history that he allowed her to reach a much more appropriate age before they consummated the marriage and began having children. So, from what I could tell, he was a very good guy for the time and period. There was mention of him burning people at the stake, which I found out I am a descendant of that party as well. However, in my own family research, I actually came across a much more interesting story about these two castles that I wish they would have explained more. So, one of his mistresses from before he got married was my ancestor, Margaret Drummond. This would be my 17th great grandmother. Now, her tombstone reads that she was poisoned along with two sisters and two brothers at breakfast one day. Her tombstone also alludes that she was secretly married to the King of Scotland, King James the Eighth. I'm sorry, King James the Fourth, which she shared a 3-year-old child with at the time. Supposedly, they were awaiting papal dispensation, which would be required due to a extremely remote familiarity. They shared a great grandparent, which was not uncommon with British royalty at all. Sorry. Now, this secret marriage would mean she was poisoned in order to force King James into marrying the wife of King Henry VIII of England. As many know, there was a lot of drama in regards to the marriages of King Henry VIII and his pursuit for a male heir. Now, this was very much in part due to the marriage of his sister and King James IV. I believe in retaliation of being forced to marry his sister is the reason why they kind of played a little bit of a mental game and married and named one of their children after the brother in which died in order to make King Henry VIII king. Now, there is some evidence to show that this union actually did take place in historical records when King James the Fifth was in power. My ancestor, Margaret Stuart, born in 1498, was named an official sister of the king. So there is some historical evidence, but the marriage was never recognized officially. So my ancestor, Margaret Drummond, was known as an official mistress. She did live in Stirling Castle for most of her life. However, there's no way to know for sure whether this union took place. King James IV had other children with Margaret Stuart, his wife, in which were able to legitimately rule as male heir. So it didn't actually make a difference in history. I would like to believe that this served as the inspiration between the recent Game of Thrones fictional story. As many people know, lots of TV and stories are based off of historical times, and it's just kind of my own personal feel-good story. I found this very interesting that they glossed over, because yes, there were many things that happened in his lifetime, but that marriage played a very vital role. It was known as the Union of the Rose and the Thistle, and it wasn't for another 100 years that somebody finally jointly ruled over England and Scotland, which was the entire reason to force King James to marry Margaret Stuart to begin with. So it's a dark corner of history that I personally found very entertaining, and it was all due to recognizing the names found on these documentaries. Well, yes, you may have heard 1,000 times information on King Henry VIII and heard of Edinburgh Castle and King James IV of Scotland. I would have never thought of a personal connection or learned of this story without watching this documentary and learning more of my own personal heritage.